There is a kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from shouting or betrayal. It comes from silence, from doing everything you can for someone and watching it land nowhere. You remember the little things, the way you showed up when they were stressed, the messages you carefully crafted so you wouldn't overwhelm them, the space you gave, even when every part of you wanted to move closer. You adjusted, you softened your tone, you swallowed your needs, you became more patient, more understanding, more available, and yet somehow it still feels like none of it registered. That's the painful realization no one prepares you for. Avoidants don't notice what you do for them in the way you hope they will. Not because you're insignificant, not because you're not enough, but because they are wired to value something very different from what you've been offering. And when you don't understand that difference, you end up exhausting yourself trying to be seen by someone who isn't even looking in the direction you think they are. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I should do more. Maybe I should do less. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I'm not supportive enough. Maybe if I love them better, they'll finally open up. So you give more reassurance. You become their safe place. You become their emotional anchor. You anticipate their moods before they even express them. You carry the emotional weight of the connection, and still there's distance, still there's detachment, still there's this invisible wall that makes you feel like you're standing outside of something you've been desperately trying to enter. The deepest wound isn't that they pull away, it's that they don't seem to notice what you sacrificed to stay. The late nights thinking about how to fix things, the pride you swallowed to avoid conflict, the moments you chose patience over reaction. You feel unseen, unacknowledged, unvalued, and that kind of invisibility cuts deeper than open rejection. Because at least rejection is clear. This feels like you're fading in plain sight. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what avoidance really is. Avoidance isn't cruelty. It isn't a lack of intelligence. It isn't even a lack of feeling. It's a defense system. It's a survival strategy that was built long before you arrived. Somewhere in their emotional history, closeness became associated with pressure. Dependency became associated with loss of control. Needing someone felt unsafe, so they adapted. They learned to rely on themselves. They learned to downplay their needs. They learned that emotional distance equals safety. So when you show up with devotion, with consistency, with emotional generosity, it doesn't always translate as love to them. Sometimes it translates as risk, as expectation, as a subtle loss of freedom. They don't process connection the way you do. Where you see bonding, they may see obligation. Where you see teamwork, they may feel engulfment. Where you see intimacy, they may feel exposure. This is why your efforts don't land the way you expect. You think, if I show them how safe I am, they'll relax. But safety to them doesn't come from closeness. It comes from autonomy, from knowing they can step back without losing themselves, from knowing they aren't being emotionally cornered. So while you're leaning in, trying to prove your reliability, they're leaning back, trying to preserve their independence. And the tragic irony is that the more you try to close the gap, the wider it feels, because your pursuit activates their protection. Your intensity, even if it's gentle, feels like pressure. Your consistency feels like expectation. Not because you are wrong for wanting connection, but because their nervous system interprets closeness differently. You may have noticed something that confuses you deeply. They rarely comment on the things you do for them. They don't highlight your sacrifices. They don't say, "I see how much you try." They don't always reciprocate in the same emotional language, and that absence of acknowledgement makes you feel like your love is invisible. But here's what's really happening. Avoidants are often internally focused. They regulate stress by retreating inward. When they feel overwhelmed, they disconnect from external input and concentrate on maintaining internal stability. So while you're pouring energy into the relationship, they may be busy trying to manage their own discomfort with closeness. Your acts of service, your emotional check-ins, your reassurances, they get filtered through a lens of self-protection. It's not that they consciously dismiss your effort, it's that they don't assign the same meaning to it. You see love as expressed through doing, through giving, through showing up. They often see love as the absence of pressure, as calm, as space, as non-interference. So if you are constantly trying to help, constantly trying to improve the dynamic, constantly trying to discuss feelings, they may not interpret that as devotion. They may interpret it as intensity. This is where the disconnect grows. You increase effort because you feel distance. They increase distance because they feel effort. And suddenly you're trapped in a cycle where the more you do, the less they respond. You start to feel like you're carrying the entire emotional weight of the relationship, and the exhaustion builds quietly. You begin asking yourself, why doesn't this matter to them? Why don't they see me? But the truth is more nuanced. They may see you, they may even appreciate you internally. But appreciation doesn't always translate into expression for someone who learned early on that emotional expression creates vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerous. Underneath their detachment is fear, not fear of you specifically, fear of losing themselves, fear of being consumed, fear of needing someone so deeply that it compromises their sense of control. To someone with avoidant patterns, dependency can feel like a trap, so they preemptively reduce emotional reliance. They create space, they downplay significance, they act unaffected. And when you give more, when you invest more, when you make them central in your world, it can trigger that fear even more, because now there's weight, now there's responsibility, now there's the possibility that someone might expect them to reciprocate at a level that feels overwhelming. So instead of moving closer in gratitude, they move away in self-preservation. This is why overgiving often backfires. You think sacrifice proves commitment, but to them sacrifice can feel like emotional debt, and debt creates pressure. Pressure creates withdrawal, so the very thing you believe will strengthen the bond can unintentionally activate their defenses. Tick-thick. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring deeply feels destabilizing, so they regulate by minimizing. They focus on independence, they emphasize logic over emotion, they keep conversations light when things get too deep, and when you interpret that as indifference, it hurts, because you're operating from a place where emotional closeness equals love, and they're operating from a place where emotional self-sufficiency equals safety. That's why it feels like you're speaking two different languages. You're saying, look how much I do for you. And they're saying, often silently, I didn't ask you to. Not because they don't value you, but because being needed feels uncomfortable. Being relied on feels heavy. And being emotionally depended upon feels like a loss of freedom. Here is the shift that changes everything. Avoidants don't primarily value what you do for them. They value how you make them feel about their autonomy. They value the absence of pressure. They value the freedom to choose closeness rather than feel obligated to it. The one thing they consistently prioritize is independence. And when you understand this, you start to see why chasing makes you invisible. When you overextend yourself, when you constantly reach, when you make them the center of your emotional world, you unintentionally reduce the very thing they cherish most, space. So instead of feeling grateful, they feel crowded. Instead of feeling adored, they feel constrained. But something interesting happens when you stop overgiving, when you pull your energy back, not in anger, not in manipulation, but in self-respect. When you start focusing on your own life, your own growth, your own stability, when you become less emotionally reactive and more grounded, suddenly they notice, because now the dynamic has shifted. Now they can breathe. Now closeness feels like a choice rather than an obligation. And that choice is what they value. They want to move toward you because they want to, not because they feel they have to respond to your constant effort. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean playing games. It means recalibrating your energy. It means understanding that your worth isn't proven by how much you sacrifice. It means realizing that if someone only notices you when you stop overextending yourself, that tells you something profound about what they truly prioritize. You deserve to be seen without having to exhaust yourself. You deserve appreciation without performance. And if you've been pouring from an empty cup hoping they'll finally acknowledge your devotion, maybe the real shift begins when you stop trying to earn visibility from someone who only feels safe when they have space. Because the truth is, the more secure you become within yourself, the less you'll feel the need to prove your love through overgiving. And the more you embody calm independence, the more you align with the one thing they've been wired to value all along. And that realization is both painful and empowering. Painful because it forces you to confront the imbalance. Empowering because it reminds you that your energy is yours to reclaim. And when you truly begin to reclaim your energy, something uncomfortable surfaces. You realize how much of yourself you abandoned just to keep the connection stable. How many times you silenced your own needs because you didn't want to overwhelm them. How often you convinced yourself that loving them meant shrinking parts of you. This is where the paradox becomes clear. They don't value sacrifice the way you do. They don't measure love by how much you endure. In fact, the more you sacrifice, the more unsettled they may feel. Because sacrifice implies emotional intensity. It implies depth. It implies a bond that carries weight. And weight is exactly what their system resists. Distance, however, feels clean to them, manageable, safe. When there is space, they can breathe. When there is space, they don't feel responsible for someone else's emotional state. When there is space, they can approach connection on their own terms. And this is why it feels so confusing. You equate closeness with reassurance. They equate distance with stability. You move closer to feel secure. They move away to feel secure. Neither of you is evil. Neither of you is broken. But the wiring is different. If you've been loving an avoidant, you've probably felt this invisible tug of war. You step forward, they step back. You reassure, they minimize. You open up, they deflect, and eventually you're left wondering whether the love was ever real. But love isn't always expressed through visible effort for someone who fears dependency. Sometimes their version of care looks like consistency without intensity, presence without vulnerability, commitment without emotional depth. And that can feel painfully insufficient to someone who longs to be met fully. Now we come to the core truth that changes how you see everything. The one thing avoidants consistently value is autonomy, not drama, not grand gestures, not constant affirmation. Autonomy. They want to feel like they are choosing you freely. They want to feel like they are entering closeness without being pulled into it. They want the relationship to exist without consuming their identity. So when you become emotionally self-sufficient, something shifts in their perception. When you stop orbiting around their moods, when you stop adjusting yourself to prevent their withdrawal, when your happiness no longer depends on their level of availability, you suddenly embody the very trait they respect most. Independence, not coldness, not detachment, rooted in resentment, but grounded independence, the kind that says, I care about you, but I don't lose myself for you. The kind that doesn't chase reassurance, the kind that isn't threatened by silence. And ironically, that is when they start noticing you more, because autonomy attracts autonomy. When they feel you are emotionally stable on your own, the pressure dissolves. They don't feel like they are responsible for regulating you. They don't feel trapped by your expectations. They feel invited rather than obligated, and being invited feels safe. Being obligated feels suffocating. There's another painful truth you need to hear. Emotional availability can feel threatening to someone who has learned to survive through emotional self-containment. When you open your heart and say, this is what I feel, it may inspire closeness in someone secure, but in someone avoidant, it can activate discomfort. Not because your feelings are wrong, but because deep emotional exchanges demand vulnerability in return, and vulnerability feels like exposure. So they deflect, they change the subject, they intellectualize, they downplay the intensity, and you walk away feeling rejected. But what's happening internally is often a surge of overwhelm. Your openness highlights the emotional depth they've worked hard to suppress. Your transparency invites them into territory that feels unfamiliar and risky, and so they retreat. You may interpret that retreat as a lack of care, but sometimes it's a sign that the moment felt too intense for their nervous system to process. It's not about you being too much, it's about their threshold being lower. However, understanding this doesn't mean tolerating chronic emotional absence. Compassion does not require self-abandonment. You can empathize with their wiring without sacrificing your need for emotional reciprocity. And this is where your growth becomes essential, because the goal isn't to become less emotional to accommodate them. The goal is to become emotionally grounded enough that their discomfort doesn't destabilize you. Now here's the part that often shocks people. They notice when you stop, They may not comment on your daily efforts, they may not praise your consistency, but when your energy shifts, when your presence becomes less predictable, when your pursuit softens, they feel it. Silence speaks loudly to someone who relies on your constant availability. When you stop initiating every conversation, when you stop fixing every conflict, when you stop over-explaining your feelings, the dynamic changes. Suddenly there's space on their side too, and in that space something unfamiliar arises, curiosity, sometimes even anxiety, because your constancy created stability for them, even if they didn't consciously acknowledge it. Your emotional labor maintained the connection, and when that labor disappears, they're forced to confront the possibility of loss. This is why many avoidants lean in only after you lean back, not because they enjoy playing games, but because absence creates clarity. When you're always there, they don't have to evaluate your value. When you're not as available, they begin to feel the gap, and that gap activates something real. When you become less available, not in retaliation but in self-respect, everything changes. You stop monitoring their mood, you stop measuring your worth by their response time, you stop trying to decode every subtle shift in tone, you redirect that energy inward, and something powerful happens. You regain emotional balance. Now, instead of anxiously reaching for connection, you're anchored in your own life. You have routines, goals, friendships, passions that exist independently of them. Your identity expands beyond the relationship, and this expansion is magnetic. Scarcity psychology isn't manipulation, it's human nature. What feels constant is often taken for granted. What feels autonomous commands respect. When they see that your world doesn't revolve around them, they begin to reassess their position in it. You're no longer trying to prove your worth, you're embodying it. And that embodiment forces a shift in how they perceive you, because now the relationship isn't something you're desperately holding together. It's something that either aligns with your grounded presence or doesn't. This is the turning point. You stop chasing validation. You stop performing devotion. You stop exhausting yourself trying to be seen, and in that stillness you realize something profound. The one thing they value in dependence is something you were meant to cultivate for yourself all along, not to win them, but to reclaim you. And when you stand in that calm, self-contained energy, you no longer feel invisible, because your worth is no longer dependent on whether they notice what you do. You notice yourself, and that changes everything. And when you begin to notice yourself, something else becomes painfully clear. Chasing was never bringing you closer, it was slowly erasing you. Every time you over-explained your feelings just to avoid being misunderstood, every time you sent that extra message because the silence felt unbearable, every time you tried to prove that you were different, safer, more patient than anyone else they had known, you thought you were strengthening the bond, but in reality, you were teaching them that your presence was guaranteed, and what is guaranteed is rarely valued by someone who equates security with self-reliance. Chasing makes you emotionally loud in a way that doesn't translate. It floods the dynamic with effort, and effort, when unbalanced, can feel like pressure. The more you pursue, the less room they feel they have to move naturally toward you. It's not that your love isn't deep, it's that when love turns into pursuit, it stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like expectation. And expectation is heavy. You deserve someone who meets your energy without being chased. You deserve reciprocity that doesn't require strategy. But if you've been in this dynamic long enough, you may have confused effort with devotion. You may have believed that if you just tried harder, they would finally feel what you feel. But love isn't unlocked through overfunctioning. Respect isn't earned through emotional exhaustion, and intimacy cannot be built on one person constantly closing the distance. When you stop chasing, you don't lose value. You reveal it. There is a difference between love and validation, and this distinction can free you if you let it. You may have been loving them deeply, but at some point, your giving may have shifted from love into a need for acknowledgement. You wanted them to say, "I see you, I appreciate you, I choose you, And when they didn't express that in the way you hoped, you gave more, thinking the right combination of patience and devotion would finally unlock reassurance. But avoidants are not primarily driven by the need for constant affirmation. They are driven by the need for emotional steadiness. They value calm over intensity, stability over passion, predictability over emotional highs and lows. So while you were offering grand gestures of understanding, they were quietly assessing whether the connection felt peaceful. While you were pouring your heart out, they were gauging whether things felt manageable. They don't crave validation the way you might. They crave equilibrium. And if your love feels emotionally intense, even if it's healthy intensity, it can disrupt that equilibrium in their system. This doesn't mean you dim your light. It means you recognize that emotional compatibility matters. That giving someone something they aren't equipped to receive will always feel one-sided. You can love deeply and still maintain composure. You can express affection without attaching your worth to the response. You can offer care without silently begging for recognition. When your love is grounded, it doesn't need applause. So what is the emotional currency they actually understand? Boundaries, space, non-reactivity, self-sufficiency. These aren't cold traits. They are stable traits. When you respect their need for space without collapsing internally, they feel less defensive. When you hold your own boundaries calmly, they feel less engulfed. When you respond instead of react, the dynamic loses volatility. Emotional reactivity, especially in anxious patterns, can unintentionally reinforce their withdrawal, not because your feelings are invalid, but because intensity triggers their instinct to retreat. But when you become steady, when your tone remains measured, when your life remains full, when your happiness isn't hanging by the thread of their attention, you communicate strength, and strength is something they recognize. They may not articulate it, they may not shower you with praise, but internally they register it. There's something undeniably powerful about someone who says, "I care about you, but I also care about myself." Someone who doesn't beg for closeness, yet doesn't fear it either. Someone who can sit in silence without spiraling into panic. That energy shifts everything. Because now the relationship isn't built on pursuit and retreat. It's built on two individuals choosing to stand side by side rather than leaning on each other for survival. But let's be clear about something. This shift is not about manipulation. It's not about pretending to be distant so they come running. It's not about calculated detachment. It's about authentic realignment. If you pull back with resentment in your heart, they will feel it. If you withdraw to provoke jealousy, it will create instability. If you detach while secretly hoping they panic, you're still operating from anxiety. True change happens when you genuinely reclaim your focus. When you wake up and your first thought isn't about whether they texted. When your mood isn't dictated by their availability. When you start investing in your own growth, your own healing, your own expansion. This is secure energy. Secure energy doesn't chase, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't cling, it simply exists in quiet confidence. And when you embody that, you don't have to convince anyone of your value. You feel it. The dynamic shifts not because you're trying to control it, but because you've stopped trying to control it at all. And then comes the moment that surprises you. They lean in, not dramatically, not with fireworks, but subtly. A little more curiosity, a little more initiation, a little more effort than before. Why? Because when you stopped overextending, you removed the pressure. When you stopped chasing, you restored balance. When you stopped centering them in your emotional world, you created space for them to move toward you voluntarily. This is the rubber band effect. The more one side stretches, the more tension builds. But when the stretching stops, the energy redistributes. Your calm independence gives them room to approach without feeling trapped. But here's the crucial part. Their leaning in should not be the reason you stay grounded. Your stability cannot depend on their response, because the ultimate goal was never to make them notice you more. It was to stop losing yourself. And if they come closer, beautiful. If they don't, you are still standing on your own 2 feet. You are no longer performing love in hopes of being seen. You are embodying love in a way that honors you. And maybe the deepest lesson in all of this is this. You were never invisible. You were just trying to be valued by someone who prioritizes autonomy over effort. Now you understand that what they value most is independence, and instead of resenting that, you've cultivated it within yourself, not to compete, not to withdraw affection, but to love without abandoning who you are, and that is where real power begins. And as you stand in this new awareness, something inside you matures even further. It's subtle at first. You don't wake up suddenly fearless. You don't become indifferent overnight, but you start catching yourself. You start pausing before overextending. You start noticing the urge to fix, to chase, to over-explain, and instead of automatically acting on it, you breathe. That pause is growth. That pause is power. Secure people live in that pause. They don't scramble to repair every crack the moment it appears. They understand that not every silence is abandonment, not every delay is rejection, not every shift in energy is a threat, and because they understand that, they don't contort themselves to maintain closeness. They don't overfunction to keep love alive. They don't take responsibility for emotions that aren't theirs. That's what makes them steady. That's what makes them safe. And as you adopt that steadiness, you realize how much energy you used to spend trying to hold everything together. You were managing their moods, managing the distance, managing your reactions, managing the narrative in your head. It was exhausting. Secure energy doesn't manage love. It participates in it. It shows up fully, but refuses to carry the entire weight. And when you begin to embody that, something shifts in how you see yourself. You stop seeing yourself as the one who must prove value. You start seeing yourself as someone who already has it. That's the difference. That's the transformation. There is a hard truth that will echo in your chest when you first accept it. You cannot earn someone's validation through sacrifice. You cannot bleed devotion into someone and expect them to suddenly become emotionally available. You cannot convince someone to value you by showing them how much you can endure. Love is not unlocked by proving your tolerance for neglect. It is not earned through suffering. It is not secured by becoming smaller, quieter, easier. If someone struggles with vulnerability, that struggle belongs to them. If someone fears closeness, that fear is theirs to confront. You can support, you can encourage, but you cannot heal for them. And the moment you stop trying to perform your way into being chosen, something inside you relaxes. You no longer measure your worth by their response. You no longer interpret their withdrawal as evidence of your inadequacy. You begin to see the dynamic clearly, not through the lens of self-blame, but through the lens of truth. If they cannot show up fully, it does not mean you are too much. It means they are limited in what they can give, and accepting that limitation is freeing, because now you are no longer fighting reality, you are standing in it. But to truly free yourself, you have to turn inward with honesty and compassion. Because part of this story belongs to you. There is a part of you that panicked when they pulled away, a part that felt the silence like a threat, a part that believed if you didn't act quickly, if you didn't reassure, fix, reach out, soften the tension, you might lose everything. That part of you deserves tenderness, not shame. Maybe you learned somewhere along the way that love was unpredictable. Maybe you learned that affection could disappear without warning. Maybe you learned that being indispensable was the only way to feel secure. So when distance appeared, your nervous system sounded an alarm. It wasn't weakness, it was conditioning. And healing begins when you recognize that you don't have to respond to every alarm. You can soothe yourself. You can remind yourself that someone else's withdrawal is not a verdict on your worth. You can let space exist without immediately filling it. That is strength. That is growth. When you stop chasing clarity out of fear and start asking for what you need from a place of calm, everything changes. You are no longer scrambling for reassurance. You are choosing connection from a place of stability. And if your needs are repeatedly unmet, you have the courage to acknowledge it instead of overcompensating for it. Your security begins to root itself in self-trust rather than proximity. And then you arrive at the question that defines your future. Do you stay or do you walk away? This is not a dramatic decision. It is a deeply personal one. Not every avoidant dynamic is hopeless. Some people grow when they feel safe. Some people become more open when they are met with steadiness instead of pressure. Growth is possible, but only if there is willingness. Look honestly. Are they making effort, even if imperfect? Are they trying to communicate more? Are they showing signs of awareness? Or are you still the only one adjusting? Still the only one initiating hard conversations? Still the only one carrying emotional depth? If your world feels lonely inside the relationship, that loneliness matters. If your needs are consistently minimized, that pattern matters. Staying should feel like peace, not survival. It should feel like choice, not fear of abandonment. Walking away is not failure, it is alignment. It is saying, I deserve reciprocity. It is saying, I will not shrink to remain. And sometimes loving yourself means accepting that someone cannot meet you where you stand. Not because you are too much, but because they are not ready. And now, at the end of this journey, you see it clearly. Avoidants may not notice everything you do. They may not measure love by sacrifice or devotion or emotional labor. They value independence. They value autonomy. They value the freedom to choose closeness rather than feel pulled into it. But here is the truth that transforms everything. When you cultivate independence within yourself, not to attract them, not to provoke them, not to manipulate the dynamic, but to honor your own wholeness, you stop feeling invisible. You stop proving. You stop chasing. You stop exhausting yourself for acknowledgement. You become steady. You become grounded. You become secure. And from that place, love looks different. It is mutual. It is balanced. It is chosen freely on both sides. If someone walks beside you, it is because they genuinely want to, not because you convince them of your worth. And if someone cannot value you without you diminishing yourself, you have the clarity to let go with dignity. You were never too emotional. You were never too giving. You were never unseen because you lacked value. You were simply trying to be valued in a language that did not align with your own. Now you understand. Now you see the pattern. And now you choose differently. Because the greatest shift was never about making them finally notice what you do. It was about finally recognizing that you deserve to be loved without having to earn it.